Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see everybody again this evening. We're on part 5 of our meeting. We're talking about the family and how family matters, because the family matters to God. Part 5 is entitled, Forgiveness is Hard Work, but Forgiveness Works. The family matters to God. And this gospel meeting is all about building Christ-centered families and Christ-centered relationships. And I hope we can come to a point where all of our families can be more Christ-centered. You wouldn't be able to talk about the family without talking about forgiveness. Taking a relationship that is not healthy, that is in some way damaged, and then restoring it to a point where it's healthy again, or at least where it's on the path to being healthy again. This is called the process of reconciliation. You probably already know this, but reconciliation is a hard process. It's a process that includes a whole lot of different parts. There's no way that we could cover everything that goes into reconciliation, or I would be up here talking for the rest of the night. But what we can do, what we can talk about tonight, is what Jesus said when he was asked about the most important part of reconciliation. The most important part is the ending point, the point that we call forgiveness. I can show you how he answered the question and what it teaches us about reconciliation and what reconciliation is all leading to. I remember when I was about probably 9 or 10 years old, every year my family had a tradition. We would take one vacation to the beach, and then we would take another vacation to Michigan every year when I was growing up, for the most part every year. When I was about 9 or 10, we were going to my Uncle Bill's house, and I had met my Uncle Bill. This is my grandma's brother. I'd met him several times when he had come to Tennessee. I'd never been to his house, but he had come to Tennessee, and I met him. And he was a great guy. He's fun to be around. He laughed, and he was just an awesome guy. So I was real excited because I had been to my Uncle Dennis's house several times. My Uncle Dennis was a bachelor, and so he had like the typical bachelor pad, and he lived out in a cabin in the middle of the woods, and he had canoes, and he had like the coolest place ever. And so I thought, man, going to my Uncle Bill's house, it's going to be just as cool, because all uncles are just as cool as my Uncle Dennis. And so we pull in, and first of all, he lives in the neighborhood, so I was a little disappointed by that. And then I noticed that his front yard is probably about the size of this stage. There is hardly any grass, and there is a driveway. And then he's got his house there, and I was like, well, it's all right. I'm sure he's got a big backyard. And so we get into the house, and it's me and my family, and we walk into the house, and I'm looking around, and I can tell that there probably has not been a whole lot of young people in this house. My Uncle Bill and his wife, they had children, but their children were long since grown, and I guess their grandchildren never came over, because there was nothing in this house that would make you think that a young person had been in it in the last 50 years. It was not a place for young people. And so I started looking around, and I leaned over to my dad, and I said, Dad, where's the TV? And he said, oh, Uncle Bill doesn't have a TV. And I was like, there's no TV? So I started to get a little worried. Well, then I was like, well, at least I can go in the backyard and play. So I walk in the backyard, and my Uncle Bill's wife, her name was Marilyn, and she had like a garden in the backyard. Not like a garden where you grow vegetables, but like a garden where there was like important flowers that took hours upon hours to grow, and there were waterfalls and gnomes and all this kind of stuff. There was nowhere for a young person to do anything except for step on stuff that young people are not supposed to step on. And so I was like, oh, this is just going to be great. I'm so excited to be here. So I go back inside, and I sit down on the couch, and my dad and my Uncle Bill are talking. My grandma had come with us, and she's talking. And I sat there, and I think it was probably 2 or 3 hours, but it felt about 6 weeks that they were sitting there talking. I'm bored out of my mind. And then my Uncle Bill says, hey, Matt, come with me. I want to show you something downstairs. And I was like, okay, finally. It's going to be something that is cool in this house. And so we go downstairs, and his entire basement is filled with model trains. And not just like regular model trains. He has built like an entire world down there. If you have ever seen these people who like, they have like mountains, and then they've got like the beach, and then they've got like a city, and then they've got like the farmland. He had it all. And I mean, it was probably 200 or 300 square feet of just model train stuff. It was awesome. I mean, I was like, this is the coolest thing that I've seen since I've been here, which isn't saying a lot, but it's really cool. And so we get in there, and my Uncle Bill's like, okay, well, here's how it works. And he's showing me, and the trains are going around and everything, and he's doing all the little doodads. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And he says, you can drive. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm going to drive. And so the first time around, I just let him go around. No big deal. Well, then the next time it's time for them to go around, we got to increase the speed a little bit, right? So we increase the speed, and they start going. Uncle Bill says, whoa, whoa, don't go too fast. If you go too fast, they'll come off the tracks. So the next time they come around, well, we got to see what happens when they come off the tracks, right? Full speed ahead. And we got to that first turn, and what do you know? The train and all the cars go flying off the track. And so whenever they go flying off the track, sometimes trains do that, you got to put them back on the track, right? Well, you don't just throw them back on the track and they work. That's not how it works with model trains. You have to get the angles right. You got to put each car back just at the right angle, and everything's got to click back into place. It all has to go back right, just in the right way. You don't just drop it back on the track and boom, you're ready to go again. It's a process. There's little grooves on the track, and you have to get all the wheels back onto the grooves just right. Then you have to get the locomotive just right because it's doing all the work. And then all the cars behind it have to be in line just right. It's a process. You are literally reconciling the train to the track. It takes time. You're fitting it back together. It's not an easy process. Nor is reconciliation in the family an easy process. There's a lot of moving parts. And all of them point to forgiveness. And that is what we're going to cover this evening. Let's pray together, then we'll get to work. Our Almighty Father in heaven, we want to thank you. We want to thank you so much for calling together the believers that you have called in this community. We're so thankful for this time of being with family. We understand that there's hurt in the world. We see it every day, but we trust that all is under your control. We bow before you this evening, seeking you and only you. Help our eyes to be focused on Jesus and only Jesus. Let us focus fully on him this evening. Let us never forget that the family will always matter to you. Amen. If you have a Bible, open into Matthew chapter 8. If you have a Bible on your app, like on your phone, open into Matthew chapter 18, not 8. Matthew 18. If you have the Bible memorized, you don't need to open your Bible, because you got it memorized. And that's really impressive. We're going to look at the story that Jesus told at the very end of Matthew 18. But I'm going to quickly review the rest of the chapter to give us a running start so we're all on the same page. I want to make sure that the story Jesus tells at the end of chapter 18 is understood in the context of the whole chapter. Because let me tell you, Matthew 18 it's a pretty extraordinary lesson that Jesus teaches. It's a lesson that answers some very specific questions that the disciples have. They want to know exactly what they're doing here, what their mission is. They're confused about what they're supposed to be doing as disciples of Jesus. And that confusion actually started a couple days earlier, back in Matthew 16. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they all kind of give their answers. And then, of course, we know that Peter answers correctly. And he says, well, you're the Christ. You're the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him, and make no mistake, this is a critical point in the apostles' lives. Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven did." And then he goes on to say, "And upon this rock," in other words, upon this faith that you just exhibited, I'm going to build my," then he used a Greek word, ecclesia. "I'm going to build my ecclesia." That's what we translate as church in 2022. But what you have to understand is that this is the first time that Jesus uses this word in that culture, at that time in history. The word ecclesia didn't have any religious significance at all. The apostles probably were kind of confused by it. In fact, Jesus uses the word here. It probably confused the apostles to the point of, what is this guy doing? When he said, "I'm going to build my ecclesia," in that time and in that culture, the word ecclesia was more of a concept. It was more of a concept, a gathering, usually of townspeople or a gathering of leaders, kind of like a town hall meeting would be today, when a group gathered to make decisions that affected the whole group. That's what an ecclesia was before Jesus used it in Matthew 16. So Jesus is basically saying, good job, Peter. That's what I'm going to build my town hall meeting on. It would have created a lot of confusion. So much so that it created an argument in chapter 18. So much so, the apostles asked, who is going to play the most important role in the town hall meeting? Who's going to be the greatest in this town hall meeting? Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? When the apostles asked this question, Jesus decides to instruct them. So he says, okay, guys, grab a seat. This is at the beginning of Matthew 18. Jesus casts a vision for what the church family will look like. And everything he says about the church family applies to us if we want Christ-centered families. First, he begins saying, first of all, you guys, you apostles, you got to quit arguing. And you got to quit worrying about who's going to be in charge, because if you don't change and become like a child, you're not even going to be a part of this thing. And then he goes on to say, when you begin to become more and more childlike, you're going to be more susceptible to sin, more vulnerable to sin. And he continues on. And he says, because of that, you'll have to learn to have hard conversations with one another. And here's how that works. When one member of the family begins to make decisions that are hurting the family or themselves, then you have to go to them like a shepherd would go to their sheep. And then he continues on, and he continues to cast this vision. And at one point he reaches a climax in the lesson when he says, my church family will be God's representation of God's authority on earth, so that whatever they bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And he reaches this huge climax in the lesson, but he did it without Peter, because Peter got stuck way back on the point of hard conversations. Peter was still present, but he wasn't paying attention. Peter is lost on the hard conversation piece. And he says that looks a lot like forgiveness. And so Jesus continues this huge miraculous lesson, and after Jesus lays out the climax of the whole lesson, the whole point to everything, Peter is still lost, and he's still thinking about forgiveness. And so Peter raises his hand, and he says, Jesus, I have a question. And Peter would have known that teachers of the law at the time said you'd have to forgive a brother 3 times. So I think Peter would have had some pride in him at this point, and he says something along the lines of, Jesus, I can see how important forgiveness is going to be in this family that you're talking about. And Jesus, look at this. I'm just thinking, when I forgive people, should I forgive them 7 times? That's more than twice as many as the Pharisees would say. So clearly, I know what I'm talking about, Jesus. 7 times, Jesus. That's more than we're supposed to. And that's where we pick up today's lesson. Matthew 18, starting in verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. You may have a translation that says 7 times 70. They both have the same implication. Basically, Peter, you're way off the mark. You're missing the point. If you think you'll be able to count and keep track of the number of times you forgive someone in your family, in a Christ-centered family, you don't understand forgiveness, Peter. You're missing the boat. That's not how it works. You won't be able to keep track. In fact, you shouldn't even be trying to keep track. Forgiveness is best given over and over and over, rinse and repeat. As one scholar puts it, Christ is saying here that forgiveness is like breathing. So let's play a game real quick. I want somebody to raise their hand if you know. How many times have you breathed today? Anybody know? How many times have you breathed since I started this lesson? Or maybe even a little bit easier. How many times have you breathed since I started talking about breathing? Surely you keep track, right? Breathing is foundational for you to be alive. You cannot live without breathing. I'm sure something inside of you is keeping track, right? No, it's not. Of course not. That would like be trying to keep up with how many times you've forgiven someone. And that's the point. It's ridiculous to think that in a Christ-centered family you'd be able to keep up with how many times you've forgiven someone. For the God-centered household, forgiveness is like breathing. It is foundational to every healthy relationship. For the Christ-centered household or the God-centered household, forgiving is like breathing. It is foundational to every healthy relationship. And so the vision that Jesus is casting for his church family and his Christ-centered family, we, the Christ followers, we will become the world's preeminent experts in forgiveness. We would be what this lost and dying world looks to when they think of forgiveness. We're supposed to be the models of forgiveness. So the question that I would ask and want you to think about, how are we doing that in our churches today? Do you think the world looks to the church as a place of forgiveness? Do you think that the world looks at the church as a place where there's a whole bunch of experts on forgiving people in there? Fortunately, I don't think so. How about your families? Is your family an expert forgiving group? Are you an expert forgiver yourself? As the world expects, should we be experts on forgiving? Of course. Jesus goes on to tell a parable about this servant. It's a parable intended to teach us about forgiveness. This is down in verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. We can stop right there for just a second. Let me clarify this. For the vast majority of people in that culture, so for the 12 apostles who are listening to this story and Jesus himself, 10,000 talents would be more money earned than any of them would ever see in their lifetime. 10,000 talents would be more money than any of them could ever earn in their lifetime. Picking back up in verse 25. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. So what does this teach us about forgiveness? Well, it teaches us that in order to get forgiveness, we have to somehow name the debt. We have to articulate here what is owed. This master that was going to get forgiveness, he didn't focus, or he's going to give forgiveness, he didn't focus on the servant. He never said, "Look at the wrong decisions you made to incur this debt. Look what you did to lose this money." Instead, he focused on the amount that he was out. He was focused on the damage that had been done. That is an important element when it comes to receiving forgiveness. We've got to learn in the family to say, "Hey, this hurts. What you did, it hurts." We have to name the pain. We have to articulate the pain. Here's the trick. The pain is so deep and so intricate in some cases that we have to feel the pain for a while to fully understand it. To be able to fully understand the pain and the depth and the breadth, we have to experience the pain for a while. To be able to properly articulate the pain, we have to experience it. We can't ignore it. That's why forgiveness is so oftentimes a journey. Sometimes to get to the point of forgiveness and resolution, then you have to sit in the pain so you can understand it. Because once you understand it, then you can tell somebody about it. You can articulate the hurt that it's caused you. For forgiveness to be meaningful, we have to name the pain. For forgiveness to be meaningful, we have to be able to name the pain. In fact, we need to name it in such a way that it makes the other person want to lean in and deal with it. Let's face it, that's a skill. Being able to express your pain in a way that makes sense to someone else is one thing. Being able to explain your pain and make it where they want to lean in and understand it and discuss it, that's something completely different. There are some wrong ways to do this. If I was to package up all my pain and then just vomit it all on you all at one time, that's like basically saying, "Well, you want to feel my pain? Here you go. Boom. There it all is right there." If that's the way that we delivered it, maybe it might inflict a whole lot of pain at one time. But then when we wake up the next morning, we still got the pain, even though we've given it to somebody else. Because we didn't deal with the pain. We just gave the pain in a way to hurt somebody back. What is needed is we must lean into the pain and discuss it with the person. That is what is required. Now we tell ourselves, all I need to hear is him or her say they're wrong. If they would just say that they messed up, all this would be over. Well, that's not really true either. What we need them to understand is that we need them to see how we felt when it happened. It would also be wrong to just ignore the pain. That is my temperament. I don't like to talk about my feelings. I don't mind talking about other people's feelings. I actually feel like I'm a pretty decent counselor. But I hate talking about my own feelings. So I tend to just stuff all of my pain deep down inside. And I'll just take it to the Lord, and He's going to take it away. I'll avoid a hard conversation. Now granted, that happens when a person that hurts you is no longer in your life, or no longer available, so you can't talk about it with them. That happens sometimes. But more times than not, there are hard conversations that we need to have with people in our lives, people in our families. Now the opposite extreme is also bad. If you stuff it down, it's bad. The opposite is bad too. If you say that you're hurt all the time, if all you do is bring up pain, well, that's also not good. I can't be the person that listens to all the problems. Nobody wants to be that person. Solomon addressed this, and who better to address this than the guy with 100 wives? Solomon said in Proverbs 19, "It is to a man's glory to overlook an offense." And the term that is used there for an offense, the Hebrew word there for an offense, doesn't mean sin or wrongdoing. It means something more like being annoying or rubbing someone the wrong way. It is the person that puts the toilet roll upside down. You guys know what I'm talking about? There's a right way to put a toilet roll on the little holder, and there's a wrong way to do it, right? And the person that does it, maybe they do it incorrectly every single time. Well, Solomon would say those kind of things aren't that important. They don't impact the relationship that much. There are things in the family that happen that you just need to learn to get over and not be sensitive about. Once again, it's not about saying, "Honey, I know you should put the toilet paper roll on upside down again, so I want to let you know I forgive you for that." That's not a good way to be. That's not the place for forgiveness. There are wrong ways to say you're hurt, not saying it at all, and saying it too often. But the bottom line is we have to learn how to recognize what truly needs forgiveness. Jesus then goes on and he takes a twist that we don't necessarily see coming to kind of show what does need forgiveness. Matthew 18, starting in verse 28. "But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Stop right there and recognize this is not a large amount of money. 100 denarii is nothing compared to 10,000 talents that we were just talking about. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him in the same way that he had just fallen down to plead with his master. Now this guy is pleading to him. 'Have patience with me and I will pay you.' He refused, and he went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. And oh, was the master upset. Then his master summoned him. Then his master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had just had mercy on you?' And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt." Now before I read this next sentence about when Jesus speaks, let me explain something. Jesus has been in this story. He's been telling the story to his audience, but then he kind of steps out of the story for just a second. And he steps back into real life. And he looks into the eyes of the apostles. So he's been telling this story, and it's all been about them, these characters that Jesus has created for this story. Well, then Jesus kind of steps out of the story. And I imagine that he looks the apostles in the eyes. He looks into the eyes of the men who'd given up their life to follow him. And then he says, verse 35, he says, "So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." Man, that's some serious words from Jesus. Probably some of the hardest words that Jesus ever had to speak. Don't you know that these words coming from Jesus, it had been tough. It had been tough to hear. It had been tough for Jesus to say. Never underestimate the seriousness with which God views unforgiveness. Never underestimate the seriousness in which God views unforgiveness, especially in the family. Seriousness with which God views it. And some of you might be saying, "You know what, Matt, that's true, but look, you don't understand what he did. You don't understand what she's done. God, you want me to forgive him, and I get that. But such and such betrayed me." And God says to you, "That's true. That person did betray you, and that's a terrible thing. But haven't you betrayed me? And haven't I forgiven you? But God, you don't understand. That was our wedding vows. She broke our wedding vows. She broke her covenant with me, God." And then God would respond with, "Haven't you broken your covenant with me? And I forgave you." Listen, there is nothing anyone in your family has ever done that God is not willing to forgive you for doing worse. And so the God in heaven that gave us forgiveness says to us, "How dare you not forgive? How dare you not forgive?" I was in a conversation, this was several months ago, and I was talking to somebody, and this person asked, why is it harder to forgive people in our own family than those outside of our family? Well, number one, we're closer to our family, so the pain is always worse. Number two, we have a lifetime worth of ruts in our communication patterns with our families, and it's hard to get out of. It's true in my family. I'm sure it's true in yours too. Every single family gathering, I say to myself, you know what? I'm not going to let myself get drugged down this path or that path. Thanksgiving's coming up, and I think, I'm going to go spend time with my family. And I'm like, all right, I always get drugged down this path. I'm even in a bad mood. It's not happening this year. This year, everything's going to be great. Every single time. Where does it go? Right down the same path. Because we're stuck in those same ruts. We have ruts in our family. Making forgiveness in our family is very difficult. Be the person that gets the family out of the rut. Be the person that allows forgiveness to enter into the conversation and forces hurt out the door. And then there's another question you're probably thinking of. Well, you know what, Matt? I get it. We should do that. But you don't get it. She or he hasn't earned my forgiveness yet. He or she, they haven't earned my forgiveness. I need to hear certain things from them first. I need them to do certain things first, and then I'll be ready to forgive them. And interestingly enough, there is nothing here that Jesus teaches about forgiveness that agrees with that mindset. Never once does Jesus say anything about that in this story. Interestingly enough, the reason for that is very simple. The servant who wouldn't forgive ended up in prison, because that's what unforgiveness does to us. It puts us in prison. We find ourselves in the prison of our own unforgiveness. And only we can unlock that prison. We tell ourselves, you know what? He needs to be the one to unlock it. She needs to be the one to do the work. But in reality, we sit in our own prison of unforgiveness holding the key. Because when we forgive, we don't do so for their benefit or because they have earned it. We don't forgive to somehow help or benefit them. When I forgive, it is for my benefit, to get me out of prison. Expressing forgiveness is not something we do for the other person. It is something that we do for ourselves. Expressing forgiveness is not something we do for the other person. It is something we do for ourselves. Because it means we value the relationship. It gets us out of prison. So when Jesus talks about forgiveness in the church family, which is to talk about forgiveness in any family, he tells us that first of all, it's like breathing. It's going to happen over and over and over and over again. Don't try to keep count. If you're keeping count, if you can count it up, you're not forgiving enough. And then he also tells us you have to get your hands around the pain. You have to be able to talk about it. You have to be able to articulate it. You have to be able to say what it is so the person understands it. So that the other person not only understands it, but that they want to lean in and they want to learn about your pain with you. You have to be able to do that. And lastly, he tells us this is not something that you're doing for them. This is something that you are doing for you. To get yourself to move forward. That is what Jesus has to say about forgiveness in the Christ-centered family. I asked you earlier how many times you breathed. I don't think anybody kept count. If you did keep count from that point until now, you should have been paying more attention to the sermon and not counting your breath. But I want you to think about how many times you've forgiven someone in your family this week. Think about that for a moment. Can you count how many times you've forgiven somebody in your family this week? If you could count it, you didn't do enough forgiving this week. Let me say all this. Let me say this. Maybe you're sitting there and your family is together and you could all do a good heap of forgiveness right now together, or maybe your family, for whatever reason, is separated. Maybe there's an estranged sibling. Maybe there's other things going on. Maybe you're dealing with divorce. Maybe the person you need to forgive is not part of your family anymore. I know how that is. I am a child of divorce. I've seen unforgiveness face to face, and let's be frank, it sucks. I'm not saying that tomorrow you should call your estranged sibling and tell them, hey, everything's going to be daisies and roses now. We'll see you at Thanksgiving. and everything just goes back to like it was when you were 8 or 10 years old, because that's not real life. I couldn't begin to understand all of the issues that different people in this room are facing with folks and their families. But what I am saying is that Jesus teaches us to forgive for a reason. Even if that person that hurts you doesn't deserve forgiveness. We are a forgiven people, so we should be forgiving people. As we close out, if you're not a Christian, God is the God of forgiveness. He is the God of grace, and He is the God of mercy, more so than you could ever understand. In fact, God knew that there would come a time when you would have to decide if you were going to give your life over to Him or not. He knew. He knew that there would come a time that you, insert your name, would be alive, and you would be making the decision on if you were going to become a Christian or not. And He knew that it would be your decision. And He knew that there was a possibility that you would say no. And yet He still sent a very piece of Himself. He sent His Son to die for you because He loves you. And He's full of grace and mercy. And He wants to forgive you. If you're not a Christian, you'd like to discuss more about what it looks like to become a Christian, you'd like to sit down, we can open our Bibles as soon as this is over. No problem doing that whatsoever. If you are a Christian, for whatever reason, there's somebody in your family, whether it be your church family or your regular family, there is something that needs to be forgiven, I encourage you to start that process immediately. It doesn't happen overnight, especially if it was something serious. It's not like it's all magically going to go away and you're going to wake up and never feel that hurt again. It's a process. But the sooner you start the process, the sooner you can come to the point of forgiveness. If there's anything we can do for you tonight, come forward as together we stand.